The top stories: international media outlets said to be silent to TPLF's atrocities in South Wollo. And Human Rights Council suggests the need to capacitate democratic institutions. Hello and many thanks for joining us. You're watching Addis News Hour with the news. I'm Tabitha John. To stay with us. While the undue pressure and Western media frenzy continues, some global media outlets have opted to remain silent until the government admitted that it conducted airstrikes against military targets in Mekelle. The international media outlets have also opted to echo the cries of TPLF while turning a blind eye towards civilian deaths in South Wollo, Wuchale, as a result of TPLF attacks. The Western media's reporting on the conflict, both in northern Ethiopia and the rest of the country, has been unbalanced and consistently biased against Ethiopia. In the following piece, Shifara Ulakau looks at the nature of the Western media and what has motivated it to act in favor of TPLF.
The Ethiopian National Defense Force conducted an airstrike on military targets in Mekelle on Monday. Following this, there were some deliberate misinterpretations and misrepresentations being circulated by some international media outlets. Ethiopian Current Fact Check says, contrary to the misrepresentation, the National Defense Force airstrikes have specifically targeted TPLF arms production or manufacturing and armament repair sites. These media outlets crying about civilians dying in Mekelle while disregarding civilian deaths in South Wollo and Wuchale inflicted by the terrorist TPLF shows the fact that they still do not care about journalistic principles and impartiality.
Now that the TPLF are showing their true colors, they're stuck. Because it's like, okay, are these guys, we can't portray them as heroes anymore because they're slaughtering people, very obviously slaughtering people. What are we going to do? Second thing is, there are the media that go, well, that's okay. We can go ahead with showing the both side-isms because it's Africa. Because, of course, it's ethnic. And, oh, the Africans are killing each other. Now, so we are at a very interesting point in the media narrative where these guys have to either step up and be responsible journalists, or they are going to try to keep pushing the narrative that they bought into. They bought this lie. Are they going to stick with it or not? Quite frankly, I can't tell you which, but it's going to be sure as hell interesting, because nobody wants to say, I was fooled, I was duped, I made a mistake, these guys lied to me. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to be the chump, but they're going to have to.
This has led journalists to come to the conclusion that some Western nations, with the help of their media, are more concerned about regime change rather than the suffering of innocent civilians.
These Western powers have a clearly visible agenda against Ethiopia, the Ethiopian government, and the Ethiopian people. That is essentially to effect a regime change in Ethiopia, because we can see these interests of the Western powers in their statements here and there.
The U.S. foreign policy makers came up with a doctrine that the U.S. should secure what's called a preponderance of influence over all countries, meaning having a plan to change a regime of any country not under the direct control of the United States.
While doing so, they are intentionally or unintentionally being patronizing toward Ethiopia.
These European saviors, these governments posturing as European saviors of a Black African nation. Samantha Power, I think I told you at the beginning, she called a high ministerial meeting of white saviors from all the European countries and the United States and Japan, which is more or less part of that bloc. I mean, I really think he should just speak out as to how ridiculous and patronizing and presumptuous this is.
Drawing on this entire, one can conclude that these media outlets were also hoping that the TPLF's advance in pockets of South Wollo would materialize.
Ethiopian Human Rights Council suggested for the government to capacitate democratic institutions and ensure rule of law across the nation. The council highlighted gaps observed during the country's general elections conducted in June and September. Kazahun Chane reports the detail as follows.
Established back in 1991, the Ethiopian Human Rights Council has been playing its share in ensuring rule of law, democratization, and the respect of human rights in the country. In his preliminary report about the 6th general elections, Executive Director of the Ethiopian Human Rights Council mentioned the gaps observed during the country's general elections conducted in June and September.
We have been, mobilizing, organizing our voters, trainers, and also election observers. With our election observers, we have been engaged in all election process, the previous one, and as well as the September 20 election, and as well as the referendum, actually. So with our observation, we have seen some gaps or some irregularities. That includes minors engaging in election process, whereby they have the election card, and then we have been observing while they cast their vote, but they are minor. So according to the law, they cannot vote until they reach the age of 18. That is one gap. The other gap, the security personnel, like the police, were closely engaged in election station activities. For example, like picking up a ballot box and moving it here and there. The other thing is election executors were acting beyond their mandate. Like guiding and telling the voters to vote for a specific, party, which is against the law. The other thing is our observers in some areas were, unable to observe their duty. Even in some polling stations, they were kicked out.
The executive director suggested the government to capacitate democratic institutions and ensure rule of law across the nation.
But there were actually a positive, pointers that can be appreciated. That includes like the voters' turnout. People were engaged, enthusiastically, and also. For example, the IDP's election center or IDPs were able to choose, with a specially established IDP's polling stations, which we would like to really appreciate because Ethiopia has already ratified the Kampala Convention. So according to the Kampala Convention, and as well as the NEBE, regulations, IDPs were, given the right to have their own specially established polling stations. That's what we have been observing. They were able to cast their ballot with specially established polling stations. So these are the main pointers that can be, appreciated.
According to him, the council would like to see more independent, more vibrant, and more active democratic institutions.
The Ethiopian government has a duty, to make the democratic process progressive. To do this, the government has to take bold steps, which actually many of it has already been started, like the reform that we are observing at the national human rights institutions, like the Commission, the Ombudsman, as well as the Ethiopian Electoral Board. The reform that we are seeing is really something to be appreciated. The same goes to, the judiciary. So our recommendation would be the government need to enhance, need to, add more energy and some other bold steps so that we would, and the country at large would enjoy the true and genuine democracy.
It was also noted that the Ethiopian Human Rights Council would celebrate its 13th anniversary.
Welcome back. Spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Dina Mufti, said the dissolution of the recent meeting of the European Union without any agreement manifests the failure of self-centered countries to win alliance from others that are in a rational position. The breakup of the meeting of EU member countries that was intended to impose sanctions on Ethiopia apparently shows cogent countries' indifference to those that are calculating only their benefits at the expense of others, the spokesperson explained. Dina elaborated that some countries' position on Ethiopia is biased and groundless, calling them to reconsider their stances for the sake of the truth. Ethiopia's current fact check unveiled that The Telegraph continued its streak of misinforming its readers regarding events in Ethiopia. In its latest article titled, Ethiopian PM threatens to stop food aid entering the country, author Will Brown blatantly misquoted Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia to bolster a preordained narrative in which Ethiopia must be vilified. At the same time, insurgents of the TPLF are spared criticism, if not outright praised. According to The Telegraph, the Prime Minister stated, if we make sure that this thing called food aid does not enter Ethiopia, 70% of Ethiopia's problems will be solved. This translated quotation from Amharic is, of course, a gross manipulation of the Prime Minister's words, which were initially delivered in Amharic. In actuality, the Prime Minister stated his desire to see Ethiopia become food self-sufficient and less dependent on food aid coming from abroad. Perhaps The Telegraph would like to reassess its assumptions of what the Prime Minister said or did not say. If translating Amharic into English is particularly challenging, they should seek help before becoming a disservice to their readers, who deserve to know the facts, added the statement. What The Telegraph has done in this article goes beyond taking things out of context or misinterpreting the Prime Minister's words. This is an unscrupulous disregard for what was said and a complete twisting of the facts for agenda-based reporting. Low-income Ethiopians who have been approached by ETV said Ethiopia's elimination from AGOA will bring negative socio-economic impacts. Let's take a look.
ስሜት ዋበሻ አባላለሁ ኢንዱስትሪያል ፓርክ ስራ መስራት ከጀመርኩ 4 አመት ከ6 ወር ሆኖኛል ከዚህ በፊት አዋሳ ፖል ፋብሪካ በሚባልበት መስሪያ ቤት ነው መሰራው መጀመሪያ ስሰራ በጣም በዝቅተኛ ብር ነው መሰራው ፖል ፋብሪካ ስሰራ ማለት ነው በሞተ ብር ነው እየሰራው የነበርኩት የመጀመሪያ ልጄን ስወልድ ያን ስራ አቆምኩኝ። ሰው አልነበረኝም ሰው የሚጠብቅልኝ ልጄ የሚጠብቅልኝ ልጄን ይዤ እየሄድኩኝ የሆነ ተመላላሽ ልብስ አጠባ ነበረ እዛ እየተመላለስኩኝ ልብስ እያጠብኩኝ ነው የምሰራው። በዛ እየተደራደርኩ ያለ ይሄ ሐዋሳ ኢንዱስትሪያል ፓርክ ስራ ሲከፈት ይሄን ስራ አግኝቼ መስራት ጀመርኩ። ሁለት ልጆች አሉ። ጠዋት ተነስቼ በጠዋቱ ቁርስ እሰራለሁ። ልጄን ቀስቅሼ አጣጥቤ ወደ እናቴ ቤት ይዤ እመጣለሁ። ቤት የማይቆዩት ያው ሰራተኛ ቀጥሬ የማስጠብቅበት ብር የለኝም። ማገኛት ገቤ በጣም ትንሽ ናት። ሰራተኛ መቅጠር ስለማልችል ነው። ባለቤት አለኝ ግን የባለቤቴ ደሞዙ ያነስተኛ ነው። የቀን ስራ ነው። ካገኘ ይሰራል። ሌላ ገቤ የለኝም ከሱ ውጪ። በዛ ነው ሁሉንም ነገር ማድረግበት። የቤት ክራዩም የወተት ክራዩም ሁሉ ነገሩን እኔ ነኝ የምሸፍነው። እኔማ በተለይ ከተዘጋማ እኔ ቀኑ ነው የሚጨልምብኝ። ቀኑ ይጨልምብኛል። እኔ በተለይ ቀኑ ይጨልምብኛል። እኔ እንጃ እኔ መናገር ቃላት ያጥሩኛል ከተዘጋ። ከኔ ጋር የሚሰሩ አሉ፣ አካል ጉዳተኞች አሉ። ይሄ ሁሉ በዚሁ የሚተዳደረው እና እባካችሁ አትዝጉ። ብዙ ችግርተኞች ብዙ የተጎዱ ጉዳተኞች አሉ። ስለዚህ እባካችሁ አትዝጉ። ከዘጋችሁ ምን ተዳደርበት ቦታ የለንም። ምን ተዳደርበት ስራ የለንም እና እባካችሁ አትዝጉ።
Professor of International Economic Law, Melaku Desta says the Ethiopian government needs to be ready for subsidizing investors and their employees if Ethiopia is terminated from the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. With regards to achievements so far, he said Ethiopia's revenue from the opportunity has increased from $10 million in the year 2000 to $300 million at this time. Daniel Kasahun has talked to the scholar.
When AGOA was introduced in 2000 during the Clinton administration, I remember looking at the data, and Ethiopia's exports annually at the time was in the region of some $10 million a year.
The introduction of African Growth and Opportunity Act realized during the Clinton's administration in 2000, and it was a fortune for developing countries to export their industrial products to the United States market duty-free. Until 2015, many of the African countries used the opportunity to earn foreign currency and develop their industries. In 2015, the initiative came into renewed for 10 years during Obama's administration. Now 4 years are remaining for the developing countries to exploit the opportunity and help their nation's prosperity. So far, Ethiopia has increased its revenue from the pact $10 million USD in 2000 to $300 million USD this time.
Ethiopia has used the AGOA opportunity as the means of marketing, as a tool to market itself before the foreign investors, for example. It went out to the foreign investors community saying, look, if you are able to produce goods in Ethiopia, you would have duty-free access to the US market right away. And that, especially using the industrial park schemes that we have over the past few years, I think Ethiopia has benefited significantly.
The professor attributed the achievements so far with the expansion of industrial parks in the country.
The industrial development scheme, I'm sure, has contributed, because if you look at the type of products in which Ethiopia is doing well, you will see that textiles and apparel and the leather industry, the leather goods industry, shoes and leather products, they account for a significant portion of that. And those are directly related to the industrial parks, I think, especially textiles. And in terms of textiles in particular, you can see that the employment opportunities created as a result of that is quite significant.
Melaku also advises the Ethiopian government to be ready for subsidizing the investors and their employees if African Growth and Opportunity Act terminate the country for short term.
Now the government's resource might be rather limited, but I would still say a penny spent today would be worth several dollars tomorrow. If the government invests money today, wherever that money comes from, and supports these companies, I think it will be worth every penny, worth all the pain, because it's going to save jobs, it's going to save skilled people on their jobs. They will be available tomorrow. It's always hard to start something new. It is much easier to keep it going, even if we might be making losses in the short term.
The American Chamber of Commerce in Ethiopia has recently asked the United States and Ethiopian governments and policymakers not to rush to revoke Ethiopia from the list of AGOA privileged countries.
And finally, 3 African women received the International Women of Courage Award this year. Among them was Zara Mohammed Ahmed, who was once a refugee in Tanzania during Somalia's civil war. She has returned home and is continuing her fight for human rights, especially for young women in Somalia. Habtamu Ashagri presents CGTN's report.
Mid-70-year-old Zara Mohammed, a former refugee and now human rights advocate in Somalia. Zara fled to Tanzania after the onset of Somalia's civil war in 1991. Upon her return to Mogadishu 8 years later, she started a women-led union to advocate for peace and engage in dialogue with militias and warlords.
When a country collapses, the youth and women suffer most. We started a process to disarm the school-aged boys. We were 61 members. We named our union HINA, which literally meant Women for Peace. We started to sit down with leaders of the clan militia. We had to talk to them about our interest to disarm these boys and take them to school. We taught them the language and hired teachers for them. We bought chairs and opened a temporary school in every checkpoint. The schools were from the airport road to as far as the 30th Street.
In addition to opening schools, the women-led initiative also raised funds to build hospitals.
We were able to successfully open Banadir Hospital. Women suffered from fistula. Babies were born by traditional midwives. They carried out operations while it was still dark, and razor blades were their only tools. We mobilized some trained midwives, approached doctors, and engaged with the militia who controlled Banadir Hospital during that time.
A special focus to Zahara was the challenge faced by women in communities filled with violence. To further push the empowerment agenda, she founded the Somali Women.
We started SWDC in 2010 before the start of the famous 2011 drought. It was founded by a Somali Women Union. The entire board members were Somali women. We wanted to assist women from 3 different aspects: building the economic capacity, assisting in the re-establishment of social issues like hospitals and schools for their children, and advocating for their political representation.
Dara Sifetis did not go unnoticed in March. She was one of 3 African women chosen to receive the annual International Women of Courage Award. The prize recognizes women around the world who have demonstrated exceptional leadership in advocating for peace, equality, and justice.
You're watching Addis News Hour. A quick reminder of the day's headlines. International media outlets said to be silent to TPLF's atrocities in South Wollo.